Some men are afraid of pain. Others are afraid of memories. Nobody in St. Gabriel Medical Center understood which one Ethan Mercer was running from. The call came in just after 7 p.m. A 48-year-old pickup truck had drifted off a rural highway outside Cedar Ridge, and the driver had been brought in for evaluation. The injuries were not considered life-threatening. The man was conscious, stable, alert, but from the moment he arrived, the entire emergency department seemed to shift around him. Ethan sat upright on the hospital bed, broad shoulders tense beneath a worn gray jacket, his jaw locked so tightly that the muscles in his face looked carved from stone. Every attempt to examine him ended the same way. No, a nurse approached with a blood pressure cuff. No, a physician asked to check his condition. No, another staff member offered pain medication. No, the answers were calm, firm, absolute. He never raised his voice, never threatened anyone. Yet somehow nobody crossed the invisible line surrounding him. Within 20 minutes, 3 nurses had stepped away frustrated, 2 doctors had exchanged confused looks, and the charge physician was already considering calling hospital security, not because Ethan was aggressive, but because he refused every form of treatment they offered. "Sir, we can't help you if you won't let us evaluate you," the physician explained carefully. Ethan's eyes never left the floor. "Then don't." The room fell quiet. Outside the examination bay, conversations began spreading through the department. Some assumed he was afraid of hospitals. Others thought he might be hiding something. A few believed he simply wanted attention. But one person said nothing. Claire Donovan stood near the nurse's station reviewing patient charts. 34 years old. White. Brown hair tied neatly behind her head. Calm eyes that rarely missed details others overlooked. She had worked in the emergency department for less than 6 months. Most people liked her. Few people truly knew her. While others focused on Ethan's refusal, Claire noticed something different. The way he sat. The way his eyes tracked every doorway without appearing to move. The way his breathing remained controlled despite obvious discomfort. The way his hands rested near his sides as though years of training had turned awareness into instinct. None of those things matched the profile of a frightened patient. Claire glanced toward the examination room again. Ethan had not touched the television remote, had not checked his phone, had not complained once. He simply watched, waiting, measuring, listening. Something about that silence felt familiar. Nearby, a younger nurse shook her head. "I've never seen someone this stubborn." Another laughed softly. "Maybe he thinks he knows more than the doctors." Claire didn't respond. Her eyes drifted back toward Ethan. For just a moment, she noticed a faded mark near his wrist where his sleeve had shifted slightly. It disappeared before she could identify it. Not a tattoo exactly. Not a scar. Something older. Something that seemed to belong to another life. Ethan suddenly looked toward the hallway. His expression changed for a fraction of a second. Not fear. Recognition. Then it vanished. Claire felt a strange chill she couldn't explain. Because for the first time that evening, she realized the man refusing treatment might not be afraid of medicine at all. He might be waiting for someone. And whatever he was waiting for had already followed him into the hospital. The evening grew quieter, but the tension around examination room 6 only seemed to deepen. Nearly an hour had passed since Ethan Mercer arrived, yet no one had completed even the most basic evaluation. The monitors remained unused. The equipment sat untouched. Every member of the staff who approached him eventually walked away with the same expression, confusion mixed with frustration. Claire Donovan continued her work as if nothing unusual was happening, moving between patients, updating charts, checking medications, and answering questions from worried families. Yet every time she passed the hallway leading to Ethan's room, she found herself glancing inside. Something about him refused to leave her thoughts. During a brief pause at the nurse's station, she opened his intake file. There was almost nothing remarkable in it. Former construction consultant. Divorced. No emergency contact listed. No military service recorded. No special notes. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Claire had learned long ago that the most carefully edited stories were often hiding the most important chapters. She closed the file and walked toward the room, carrying a bottle of water. Unlike the others, she did not enter immediately. She stopped beside the doorway and knocked softly against the frame. Ethan looked up. His eyes studied her for several seconds. Not suspicious. Not hostile. Measuring. The same way a person might study a distant sound during a storm. Claire held up the bottle. You have not had anything to drink since you arrived. Ethan glanced at it. Not thirsty. That is probably not true. A faint smile almost appeared on his face before disappearing again. Maybe. Claire set the bottle on a nearby table and prepared to leave. She did not ask questions. She did not mention treatment. She simply turned toward the hallway. Why are you different? Ethan asked suddenly. Claire stopped. Different from who? Everyone else. She considered the question. Because I am not trying to win an argument. Ethan looked away again. The room became silent. Then Claire noticed something she had missed earlier. Resting near Ethan's travel bag was a small metal keychain attached to an old brass ring. Most people would have ignored it. To them, it looked like a worn piece of scrap metal. But Claire recognized the shape instantly. It resembled a field marker used years ago by certain military units during overseas deployments. She felt her pulse quicken, not because of the object itself, but because of the memory it stirred. Before she could think further, Ethan shifted in his seat. His jacket sleeve pulled back slightly. This time Claire saw the mark clearly. It was not a tattoo. It was not a scar. It was a faded imprint left by years of wearing something against the same spot on the wrist. A band. A tracker. A military identification device. The kind most civilians would never recognize. Ethan noticed where she was looking. Without a word, he adjusted his sleeve. The mark vanished again. Neither spoke. Yet something had changed. For the first time that night, Claire was no longer wondering whether Ethan had a hidden past. She was wondering how close that past might be to her own. As she stepped back into the hallway, she heard a low voice drift from inside the room. Ethan was not speaking to her. He was speaking to himself. The words were barely audible, so quiet that anyone else would have missed them. Claire froze where she stood, because the phrase he whispered was one she had not heard in nearly 12 years. Red lantern, hold position. Claire remained motionless in the hallway long after the words faded into silence. Red lantern, hold position. 12 years had passed since she had heard that phrase spoken aloud. Most people would have dismissed it as meaningless. Random words from a tired patient. But Claire knew better. Certain phrases were never random, especially the ones designed to be forgotten. She slowly turned back toward examination room 6. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see Ethan sitting exactly where he had been before, his posture unchanged, his eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the hospital walls. The sounds of the emergency department continued around her. Phones rang. Monitors beeped. Stretchers rolled across polished floors. Yet for Claire, everything seemed distant. Her attention remained locked on the man inside that room. She told herself it could be a coincidence. A phrase remembered from an old movie. A line from a book. But deep down she already knew the truth. Red Lantern had never appeared in books. It had never existed in public records. It belonged to a world that officially did not exist. Claire walked to an empty workstation and sat down. Her hands rested quietly on the keyboard, but she did not type. Instead, she stared at the dark reflection on the computer screen. Memories surfaced slowly. A briefing room lit by dim overhead lights. Maps spread across metal tables. Voices speaking in coded responses. Red Lantern was not a name. It was a challenge phrase. The first half of a verification exchange used only during specific operations. Without thinking, Claire whispered the response under her breath. Blue horizon. The words felt strange after all these years. Familiar and distant at the same time. She immediately looked around to ensure nobody had heard her. Nobody was paying attention. Across the department, a physician was discussing laboratory results. 2 nurses were preparing medications. The world remained ordinary. Yet Claire's pulse refused to settle. 20 minutes later, she returned to examination room 6 carrying a clipboard. Ethan barely looked up as she entered. I need to update some information in your file, she said calmly. You can leave it blank, Ethan replied. Claire nodded. That is one option. She stood quietly for several seconds. Neither seemed interested in filling the silence. Then Claire spoke carefully. Sometimes people hold on to old habits longer than they realize. Ethan's eyes lifted. What does that mean? It means certain phrases stay with us. Something changed in his expression. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. A small shift that lasted less than a second. Claire noticed it immediately. Ethan leaned back slightly. You hear a lot of strange things in an emergency room. That is true. The silence returned. Then Claire looked directly at him and spoke for words she had not said in over a decade. Blue horizon. Continue watch. The room froze. Ethan's eyes widened. Every trace of distance vanished from his face. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he looked completely present. He stared at Claire as though seeing a ghost. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Outside the room, the hospital continued exactly as before. But inside, everything had changed. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Ethan continued staring at Claire as though every assumption he had made about the world during the past decade had suddenly become uncertain. The guarded distance that had surrounded him since arriving at St. Gabriel Medical Center was gone. In its place was something far rarer. Recognition. Claire remained calm. She did not step forward. She did not explain herself. She simply waited. Ethan finally broke the silence. That response was removed from circulation years ago. His voice was lower now. More careful. Claire nodded slightly. A lot of things were removed. Ethan studied her face. Who are you? Several people had asked Claire that question throughout her life. Most of the time the answer was simple. A nurse. A colleague. A daughter. A friend. Tonight was different. Claire Donovan, she replied. That is not what I asked. A faint smile touched her lips before disappearing. Ethan looked toward the closed door, then back at her. Nobody outside a very specific network would know that phrase. Claire glanced at the clipboard in her hands. And nobody outside that network would react the way you did. The silence returned. This time it felt different. Not hostile. Not defensive. More like two people carefully stepping across an old bridge that neither had expected to find again. Ethan slowly leaned back against the bed. I thought all those records were gone. Most of them are. Then how did you remember? Claire looked toward the hallway beyond the glass window. Nurses moved from room to room. Doctors discussed treatment plans. Families waited for news. Ordinary life continued only a few feet away. Some things are not written in records, she said quietly. Some things stay with the people who live them. Ethan lowered his eyes. For the first time, the exhaustion he had been carrying became visible. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The weight of years spent keeping certain memories locked away. Red Lantern was never supposed to be spoken again, he said. Neither was Blue Horizon. Ethan let out a slow breath. Then something unexpected happened. He reached for the bottle of water Claire had left earlier. The same bottle he had ignored for nearly 2 hours. He opened it and took a drink. It was a small action, almost meaningless to anyone watching. Yet Claire understood exactly what it meant. Trust was beginning to replace resistance. Across the room, one of the monitoring devices remained unused. Ethan noticed her glance toward it. You have been trying to get me to cooperate all night? Claire shook her head. No, then what have you been trying to do? Figure out why someone carrying that much discipline was refusing help. Ethan looked away briefly. Old habits. Old fears, she asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze settled on the worn brass keychain resting beside his travel bag. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a trace of sadness. Sometimes you spend so long being responsible for everyone else that you forget how to let someone take care of you. Claire understood that answer more than he realized. And for the first time since Ethan Mercer entered the emergency department, she knew with complete certainty that the real story had nothing to do with the accident that brought him there. The real story had started many years earlier, in a place both of them remembered but neither had yet named. Ethan remained quiet after that. The noise of the emergency department drifted faintly through the closed door, but neither he nor Claire seemed interested in the world outside the room. For the first time that evening, the barriers he had built around himself were beginning to crack. Not because someone forced them open, because someone had recognized what was behind them. Claire updated a few notes on her clipboard before setting it aside. You never answered my question, she said gently. Ethan looked up. Which one? Why you refuse treatment? A faint smile appeared on his face. You do not give up easily. Neither do you. Ethan glanced toward the window. Maybe that is the problem. The answer hung in the air for several seconds. Claire waited. Eventually, Ethan sighed. A few years ago, I started noticing something. What? The people who always seemed strongest were usually the worst at asking for help. Claire nodded. That sounds familiar. Ethan let out a quiet laugh. I figured it might. He looked down at his hands. They were steady now, more relaxed than they had been since arriving. I spent a long time taking care of other people, watching out for everyone around me, making sure nobody got left behind. Eventually, it became easier to carry everything myself than to trust someone else with it. Claire understood immediately. The explanation had little to do with medicine. It had everything to do with identity. Some people became so accustomed to responsibility that accepting help felt like surrender. And tonight? Claire asked. Ethan looked directly at her. Tonight, I walked into this hospital expecting strangers. His gaze softened slightly. I did not expect someone who remembered. The room fell silent again. This time the silence felt comfortable. Familiar. Like two people sitting beside an old campfire after years apart. Claire eventually reached for the blood pressure cuff resting nearby. She held it up slightly. Would this be acceptable now? Ethan looked at the device. Then at Claire. Finally, he nodded once. Yes. It was such a simple moment that nobody outside the room would have noticed. Yet for the staff who had spent 2 hours unsuccessfully trying to evaluate him, it would have seemed impossible. Claire carefully completed the basic assessment. Ethan cooperated without resistance. No arguments. No hesitation. When she finished, he surprised her with a question. How many people know? Claire understood exactly what he meant. About my past? Ethan nodded. Very few. Family? No friends. Not really. Ethan stared at the floor. Same. Claire was not surprised. Some experiences became so difficult to explain that silence eventually felt easier than conversation. Across the hallway, a physician walked past the room and glanced inside. He stopped immediately. Earlier that evening, Ethan had refused every request. Now he was calmly allowing an examination. The physician looked genuinely confused. Claire pretended not to notice. Ethan noticed and smiled faintly. They think you performed a miracle. Claire shook her head. No, then what happened? She looked at him for a moment before answering. You finally met someone who spoke the same language. For the first time that night, Ethan laughed openly. It was not a loud sound, but it carried something that had been missing since his arrival. Relief. And as the tension slowly left his shoulders, Claire realized they were both thinking about the same question. If Ethan remembered Red Lantern, then there was only one place their paths could have crossed. A place neither of them had mentioned yet. A place hidden beneath years of silence and forgotten records. The clock above the nurse's station showed 9:17 p.m. when Claire finally sat down across from Ethan. His examination was complete. The immediate concerns had been addressed. Yet neither seemed interested in ending the conversation. Outside the room, the emergency department continued its usual rhythm, but inside, time felt strangely detached from the rest of the hospital. Ethan rested against the bed and studied Claire carefully. There is only one place we could have heard those phrases, he said. Claire nodded. I know. Ethan looked toward the brass keychain beside his bag. I have carried that thing for almost 15 years. Claire glanced at it. Field marker. Ethan smiled faintly. Most people think it is junk metal. Most people would. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan asked the question both had been avoiding. What was your designation? Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She had not answered that question in a very long time. Medical support. Ethan laughed softly. That answer tells me absolutely nothing. It was supposed to. The faint humor disappeared, replaced by something more thoughtful. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Ghost Recon 17? Claire froze. It was the first time either of them had spoken a unit name aloud. A unit that officially did not exist. A unit whose records had long ago disappeared into sealed archives. Claire slowly looked up. You remember it? Ethan gave a short nod. I remember everyone who kept us alive. The words landed with unexpected weight. Claire looked away toward the hallway window. A nurse pushed a medication cart past the room. A family member walked by carrying flowers. Ordinary life. Ordinary people. None of them would ever know what that simple sentence meant. Ethan continued. Most of us assumed you left after the program ended. Claire smiled faintly. I did leave. Not far enough, apparently. She laughed quietly. It felt strange. Comfortable. Like speaking with someone from a previous lifetime. Ethan's expression became more serious. You know what surprises me? What? You became exactly what you always were. Claire raised an eyebrow. A nurse? Someone who shows up when people need help. The answer caught her off guard. Ethan noticed. You think nobody paid attention back then? He asked. People noticed more than you realized. Claire remained silent. Years earlier, she had spent most of her time in the background. Working. Observing. Solving problems. Never seeking recognition. Hearing someone remember those things after so many years felt almost unreal. Ethan reached for the brass keychain and turned it slowly in his hand. I spent a long time trying to forget all of it, he admitted. The codes. The routines. The people. He looked directly at Claire. Then tonight a nurse walked into my room and reminded me that some things are worth remembering. Claire did not know how to answer, so she simply smiled. It was enough. Outside the room, the charge physician glanced through the window and paused. He could not hear the conversation. He only saw a patient who had refused everyone else now sitting calmly with a nurse, speaking as though they had known each other for years. Neither Ethan nor Claire noticed. Their attention remained fixed on a past that was no longer hidden quite as deeply as before. And for the first time that evening, Claire began to suspect that Ethan had not entered St. Gabriel Medical Center by accident alone. Sometimes life had a way of bringing the right people back together exactly when they needed to be found. The conversation continued long after either of them realized how much time had passed. The wall clock crept toward 10 o'clock, but neither Claire nor Ethan seemed eager to return to being strangers. Years had disappeared between them, replaced by a quiet understanding that very few people ever experienced. Ethan sat comfortably now, the tension that had defined his arrival almost completely gone. He glanced around the room and shook his head with a faint smile. If someone had told me this morning that I would spend my evening talking about Ghost Recon 17 with an emergency room nurse, I would have laughed. Claire smiled. Most people would not believe it anyway. Probably not. Ethan looked thoughtful for a moment. Do you ever miss it? Claire knew exactly what he meant. Not the operations. Not the secrecy. Not the endless training. He meant the people. The sense of purpose. The feeling that everyone beside you understood things that never needed to be explained. Sometimes, she admitted. Mostly I miss the people. Ethan nodded immediately. Same. He stared at the brass keychain in his hand. There was a period when I tried reconnecting with some of them. Claire looked up. Did you find anyone? A few. His expression softened. Most moved on. Families. Businesses. New lives. That sounds healthy. Ethan laughed quietly. It does. Claire noticed something in his face then. Not sadness exactly. More like gratitude. What? She asked. Ethan leaned back and folded his arms. You know what I realized tonight? Claire shook her head. For years I thought those memories only mattered to me. He paused. Then you finished the response phrase without hesitation. Claire understood. Certain experiences felt isolated until another person proved they remembered them too. Ethan continued. It reminded me that none of us carried those years alone. Outside the room, two younger nurses passed by and glanced through the window. They immediately noticed how differently Ethan was behaving. Earlier, he had refused every conversation. Now he appeared relaxed, almost comfortable. One of them stopped Claire a few minutes later while she updated a chart. What did you do? The nurse asked quietly. Claire looked confused. What do you mean? That patient. Nobody could get through to him. Claire smiled slightly. Sometimes people just need someone willing to listen. The nurse nodded, though she clearly suspected there was more to the story. There was. Much more. Back inside the room, Ethan looked toward the hallway. They are trying to figure it out. I know. Are you going to tell them? Claire laughed softly. Tell them what? Ethan grinned. Fair point. The room grew quiet again. Comfortable silence. Familiar silence. The kind that exists between people who no longer need to prove anything. Then Ethan spoke unexpectedly. There is one thing I never understood. Claire looked at him. What is that? Why you disappeared without saying goodbye? For the first time that evening, Claire looked genuinely surprised. Ethan continued. A lot of people remembered you. The words lingered in the air. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, caught off guard by the realization that her absence had mattered more than she ever knew. And for the first time since reconnecting, she began to wonder whether Ethan remembered far more about those years than he had revealed so far. Claire did not answer immediately. Ethan's question lingered between them longer than either expected. Why had she disappeared? The honest answer was complicated, but not because it involved secrets. It involved something much simpler. Life. Claire folded her hands together and looked toward the window overlooking the hallway. I do not think I ever planned to disappear, she said quietly. Ethan listened without interrupting. When everything ended, I told myself I was going to take a few months away. I wanted something normal. A regular job. A regular apartment. Regular conversations. A faint smile crossed her face. Then 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Eventually, I stopped looking backward. Ethan nodded slowly. You built a new life. I tried. Looks like you succeeded. Claire glanced around the room. Most days, yes. Ethan looked thoughtful. You know, people used to talk about you. Claire laughed softly. That sounds dangerous. Not the way you think. Ethan leaned back. Nobody remembered ranks. Nobody remembered assignments. But everyone remembered that when things became difficult, you somehow stayed calm. Claire lowered her eyes. Compliments had always made her uncomfortable. Ethan continued. There was a reason people trusted you. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire asked a question of her own. What about you? Ethan raised an eyebrow. What about me? You spent years carrying around that keychain. You remembered the verification phrases. You never really left either, did you? Ethan looked at the brass marker resting in his palm. His smile faded into something more reflective. No, he admitted. I guess I did not. He turned the object over carefully. At first I kept it because I thought I should. Then I kept it because I could not throw it away. Eventually I stopped asking why. Claire understood completely. Some objects survived because they represented people, not places. Memories, not missions. Ethan placed the keychain back on the table. Funny thing is, tonight reminded me of something. What? Most of us spent years assuming the important part was what we did. Claire waited. Ethan smiled faintly. But maybe the important part was who we became afterward. The words settled heavily in the quiet room. Claire found herself thinking about the patients she had helped over the years, the families she had comforted, the countless ordinary moments that now filled her days. Ethan was right. The past mattered, but it was not the whole story. A soft knock interrupted the conversation. The charge physician stepped into the room holding a discharge packet. He looked from Ethan to Claire and smiled. Well, whatever happened in here, I would like to hire it for the rest of the department. Ethan laughed. Claire shook her head. The physician handed over the paperwork and left. Once the door closed again, Ethan stood slowly and gathered his belongings. The room suddenly felt different. The night was moving toward its conclusion, yet neither seemed ready to acknowledge it. Ethan picked up the brass keychain, then paused. You know, he said quietly, for years I thought I was the last person who remembered that chapter of my life. Claire met his eyes. You were not. Ethan nodded once. Simple, certain, and in that moment, both of them understood that the real value of the evening had never been recognition. It was the realization that some connections do not disappear even after years of silence. They simply wait for the right moment to be found again. The automatic doors near the emergency department entrance opened with a soft sound as Ethan prepared to leave. The discharge paperwork was folded neatly in his jacket pocket. His travel bag rested over one shoulder. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary patient heading home after a long evening. Yet something about the moment felt different. Claire walked with him toward the exit, not because hospital policy required it, but because neither of them seemed ready to end the conversation. The halls were quieter now. Most visitors had gone home. The bright activity of earlier hours had softened into the steady rhythm of a late-night hospital. As they approached the front lobby, Ethan stopped beside the large glass windows overlooking the parking lot. Rain had started falling outside, turning the streetlights into shimmering reflections across the pavement. For a few seconds, he simply stood there looking out at the darkness. You know, he said quietly, I spent years convincing myself that chapter was finished. Claire leaned lightly against the wall beside him. Maybe it was. Ethan glanced at her. Then why does tonight feel important? Claire thought about the question. Because sometimes closure is not about forgetting. Ethan nodded slowly. The answer seemed to settle something inside him. Across the lobby, a security officer waved goodbye to a departing family. A volunteer pushed an empty wheelchair toward storage. Ordinary moments continued all around them. Yet for Ethan and Claire, the evening had become something neither expected. Not a reunion, not a revelation. Something simpler. A reminder. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed the brass keychain. The worn metal caught the lobby lights for a brief moment. He studied it carefully before extending it toward Claire. She looked surprised. I cannot take that. Yes, you can. Claire shook her head. You have carried it for 15 years. Ethan smiled. Exactly. She looked at him without speaking. Ethan closed her hand gently around the small piece of metal. I kept it because I thought it was the last connection I had left. His voice remained calm. Turns out I was wrong. Claire stared at the object resting in her palm. For a moment, she did not know what to say. Ethan stepped back slightly. Keep it. Are you sure? Very. A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He straightened his posture. Not dramatically. Not for attention. Simply out of respect. Claire recognized the gesture immediately. It belonged to a world neither of them talked about often anymore. A world built on trust, responsibility, and quiet professionalism. Without hesitation, Claire returned the gesture. No words were necessary. No explanations were needed. Nearby, a young nurse walking through the lobby noticed the exchange. She did not understand it, but she understood enough to stop talking and watch. Something about the moment felt meaningful. Ethan lowered his hand and smiled. "Take care of yourself, Claire." "You too, Ethan." He nodded once and walked toward the doors. Seconds later, he disappeared into the rainy night. Claire remained where she was, holding the brass marker in her hand. The lobby gradually returned to normal. Phones rang. Conversations resumed. People came and went. Yet Claire continued staring through the glass long after Ethan's truck had disappeared from view. Some people enter your life for only a few hours and leave behind memories that last decades. Others return after years of silence to remind you who you once were. Claire looked down at the worn piece of brass and smiled. Then she slipped it into her pocket and turned back toward the emergency department. There were still patients waiting, still people who needed help. And as she walked back through the hospital doors, she carried with her the quiet certainty that respect is never demanded, never announced, and never forgotten. It is earned in silence.